This forum will be focused on income and self-sufficiency. We have lots of content and information to cover in a short period of time, and we want to ensure that we hear from you. Let me introduce you to Charlie Brennan, Deputy Director of Research. Charlie's areas of expertise include quantitative research, data analysis, geographic information systems, housing and urban development, and data visualization. Perhaps most importantly, Charlie is deeply focused on ensuring data is accessible and informs sustainable change. Later, Charlie will be joined by Ellen Giartana, CCLP's Managing Attorney, and Shar Robert, our Legislative Director. So Charlie, let's get to it. What is the Colorado Self-Sufficiency Standard and why is it important?
Great. Thank you, Tiffany, for that introduction and your question about the self-sufficiency standard. I think, rather than explain it, I think one of the easier ways to understand what it is and how it's useful is to see it in action. And so we have some preliminary numbers from our yet to be released 2022 self-sufficiency standard update that I'm pleased to be able to share with you all tonight. So it's just a quick sneak peek that I hope will pique your interest and make everyone excited for that report when it's released later on this month. So is everyone able to see my screen? I'm looking to some of the panelists. Great. So is there a slide showing? Sorry, I'm looking to folks to nod who are on my screen.
Cool. Yeah, Charlie, your slide is showing. It looks great. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Sorry about that, folks. So I think, as I mentioned, one of the easiest ways to understand what the self-sufficiency standard is to see it in action, and then also to see it in comparison to another measure of income adequacy or economic security, which is the official poverty measure. So unlike the official poverty measure, which assumes that food costs are approximately 1/3 of a household's total needed expenses for a year or for a month, the self-sufficiency standard is what's known as a basic needs budget. And so what that means is it takes estimated costs for households in various different budget items and adds them all together. And then whatever that resulting number is at the end of that summation is sort of the income needs or the estimates of income needs for that household. And so we can see here the self-sufficiency standard includes estimates for housing costs, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, miscellaneous costs, which in this edition of the self-sufficiency standard includes internet and telephone service. That was an important addition that we felt was worth adding, given all the changes during the past 2 years and sort of the importance of being able to access the internet for folks to get by in our state, as well as taxes with tax credits subtracted out if that family is eligible for any tax credits, namely the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the Child Tax Credit. So this slide shows how these two different approaches to estimating economic needs leads to very, very different results in terms of those estimates. So for a hypothetical 2-person household living in Douglas County in 2022, the official poverty measure estimates that that household would only need about $1,526 each month, or about $18,310 per year to cover all of their basic needs and have their needs met. On the other hand, when we look at the self-sufficiency standard, we can see that it is considerably larger than what the poverty threshold or what the poverty measure estimates. When we add together all of the different costs facing facing this hypothetical household living in Douglas County, we see that the self-sufficiency standard estimates that this household would need about $6,973 each month, or about $80,985 annually to cover all of their basic expenses. While the self-sufficiency standard, we feel, is a much more accurate measure of economic needs in our state, it does have its limitations and does not include all of the factors that can influence a household's ability to have their basic needs met. One of those factors, a big one, is debt. So things like credit card debts, student loans, medical bills are not, those monthly payments and those amounts are not included as part of the self-sufficiency standard. However, would just be an addition on top of, in this case, that's almost $7,000 per month that households would need to earn to cover both their basic needs and their debt payments. On the other hand, too, the self-sufficiency standard is just a bare bones sort of estimate of the minimum that a household would need, and doesn't include extras that add to quality of life, things like being able to play in a sports rec league, for instance, traveling to see family and friends, or going out to the movies. So really, this is just sort of the bare minimum of what we estimate that households need. And I'll also mention that this methodology was developed by the folks at Dr. Diana Pierce at the Center for Women's Welfare at the University of Washington. And so CCLP has worked with them for about a decade to release and update the self-sufficiency standard for Colorado every 3 or 4 years. Another neat aspect of the self-sufficiency standard is that it takes into account the methodology takes different approaches for estimating the income needed to support different age family members. So in addition to having an adult in your family, the self-sufficiency standard also allows for different estimates in terms of the needs of a preschooler, an infant, a school-age child, or a teenager. And so those needs and those costs vary as well as an infant moves through different life stages. We can see that on the slide an example of various income needs for various different types of households living in Boulder County in 2022. I think one notable thing that jumps out to me on this slide, and is true for many different counties as well, not just Boulder County, is just how incredibly expensive children are and how that adds to the income needs of households once a child is added into their family. So for instance, if we look at compare the one adult and one preschooler, we see that their income needs almost double from what they were before that child was part of the family. When we take a step even further back, we can see that all of these wage needs are well above the Colorado minimum wage of $12.56 per hour. So even if you're earning minimum wage living in Boulder County, the self-sufficiency standard suggests that you would have a difficult time making ends meet, even if you were just living one adult on your own. One really important way that the self-sufficiency standard differs from the poverty measure is its ability to allow us to estimate different income needs for families living in different parts of our state. So for those who aren't familiar, the official poverty measure is set at similar levels, varying by household size for all 48 contiguous United States. So it doesn't matter if you live in Colorado, California, or Nebraska, your wage needs or your income needs as estimated by the official poverty measure will be the same. Now, this map showing the wage needs or the annual income needs for a household that consists of one adult and one preschooler in 2022 shows just how that's such a bad assumption and how that's not even close to the reality that's experienced by folks living in Colorado, let alone elsewhere in the United States. So if we look at Eagle County, for example, a one adult, one preschool sized family would need about $89,880 to cover all of their basic needs. If that same family lived instead in Baca County, their income needs would only be about $44,553 as estimated by the self-sufficiency standard. So an incredible amount of variation across our state and really different levels of income needed to support the same family composition depending on where you live in Colorado. Now, another aspect of our most recent update to the self-sufficiency standard report is the overlooked and undercounted report. This we were able to publish with the assistance of the University of Washington at the beginning of 2020. And what it does is takes the numbers that are generated through the self-sufficiency standard and sees where Coloradans fall. Are they, how many households are above the standard and how many are below the standard? And how does that differ based on geographies or different demographic characteristics? As we've discussed, the self-sufficiency standard is a much more accurate measure of economic needs in our state. And we can really see how it's different, again, from the official poverty measure by looking at the share of households that are above, or that are, below poverty and below the self-sufficiency standard. So for the poverty measure, we find that about 7.4% of households in 2019 were below the poverty measure. At the same time, 24.9% of Colorado households were below the self-sufficiency standard. And so while this data is from a period before COVID-19 and doesn't factor into all of the economic changes that happened during and after the pandemic and over the past couple of years, I think it is striking to see that even at sort of the peak of our last recovery, still about 1 in 4 households were unable to meet their basic needs in our state. And we can see, again, the rate of self-sufficiency or income inadequacy varies across different demographic groups in 2019. I've just had a few examples here of the different ways that this data is parsed and disaggregated in the overlooked and undercounted report. And so I encourage you to take a look to see, to find more, because there's a lot more data in that report to go over. But just, at a high level, I just wanted to highlight some findings from that report. First, households of color tend to have higher rates of income inadequacy than white households in Colorado. Households with children, particularly single mothers, and particularly within the single mothers category, single mothers of color, had some of the highest rates of income inadequacy in our state, with nearly 3 in 4 households unable to meet their basic needs with their income. The same is true by educational attainment, with folks with lower levels of educational attainment experiencing higher rates of income inadequacy than folks with higher levels of educational attainment. Again, we can see the impact that not having children has on households' ability to make ends meet. You're far more likely to be able to make your income cover all of your basic needs without children in the picture. And that likely has to do a lot with the high cost of childcare, not just in Colorado, but across our country. On the other hand, I think it is striking to note that even if you are living in a household where one person is employed full-time year-round, still about 23.7% of those households did not earn enough income to cover their basic needs. So, employment alone isn't enough to ensure economic security for Coloradans. Another way that we can look at the data presented in the overlooked and undercounted report is by trying to estimate, what's the total gap between what Coloradans who are below the self-sufficiency standard earn and what they would need to earn in order to be above or at the self-sufficiency standard. So when we take that difference and add it up for all these various housing types, or households, that are below the self-sufficiency standard, we find that about $10.3 billion would be needed in 2019 to move those households that are below the self-sufficiency standard to that level of self-sufficiency. Now, on its own, that's a huge amount, right? That's a large amount, far bigger than any sort of public program that we have here in Colorado, or most public programs that we have here in Colorado. However, I think when you look at it in the context of the total amount of income that was earned by households in our state, and here we can see that aggregate amount of income distributed across different percentiles, that it's not as radical of an idea to think that through policies and through different choices, we could create a much more fair distribution of this income so that every Coloradan is able to meet their basic needs in our state. And finally, just really quickly, I did want to give some logistics about when to expect the recent updates, or the most recent update for the 2022 numbers. We anticipate that will be ready for publication in October 2022. We're just working now with the University of Washington on coming up with a first draft, and so we'll be in the process of editing that draft throughout the rest of the month. However, I did want to put in a quick plug for folks who are interested in having either myself or someone else from CCLP attending your organization or group meetings, if you have one, and you'd like us to present some information about the self-sufficiency standard, about the overlooked and undercounted reports and those findings, we're more than happy and willing to do so. And we'll definitely make every attempt to tailor the information that's presented in our presentations to be most relevant to your county or your region of the state. So I just threw up some contact information there, but feel free to reach out to really anyone at CCLP, and we'll make sure that you're connected with the right folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate that very much. We have a number of questions that folks have been asking, and we've been collecting those questions. I'm wondering if, in looking at some of those questions, I wonder if you could address perhaps some of the limitations briefly on the study. And meanwhile, I'm going to put into the chat a link to the overlooked and undercounted report that you mentioned so that folks have an opportunity to access that data.
Great. So I'm just looking through the chat here and I see there's questions about, right. So so the data that, at least for the self-sufficiency standard report. So there's two different reports I'll be clear about that's included in this larger self-sufficiency standard. There's the numbers report, and then there's the share of households that are above or below the self-sufficiency standard in Colorado. For the households that are above or below the self-sufficiency standard, so in that overlooks and undercounted report, we do not include households who don't have at least one working adult that's between the ages of 18 and 64. And the reason for that is because the challenges and the quite honestly, the approaches that would be needed to support older folks with disabilities would be very different from just the population as a whole in many cases. That's not universally true, but that's sort of the thinking behind separating out those groups specifically. There's things with SSI, SSDI that make, sort of those groups receiving those benefits or those participating in those programs sort of have different considerations than folks who aren't facing those challenges.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And we will get to some of the other questions that have been raised in a moment. Let me invite the other panelists to join us in the meantime. So please hang on. We'll have a larger conversation here in just a moment. So as I mentioned earlier, Shar Robert and Ellen Giratana will be joining the panel. So let me ask the following question, and I'll just get right to it. What are the barriers for those that continue to fall behind despite the growing economy in Colorado? And how can we create a more sustainable and equitable income landscape in Colorado?
I can go ahead. One of the big things that I've been working on at CCLP is the impact of criminal records on a person's ability to grow their earnings over their lifetime. So I think Randall in the chat kind of alluded to this issue of being previously incarcerated, but also just having a record. You don't even have to be incarcerated to have a lower level offense really impact your ability to make sufficient income. And so some of the work that we've been doing here is to create a better avenue for record sealing in partnership with a huge coalition of partners to ensure that people have their records sealed automatically, because it's very tough to do it on their own through the courts. I think that another issue is creating pay equity across, different swaths of people. I think in Colorado, there's a huge disparity in terms of, what Charlie just alluded to. And one of the things that we need to be better, I think, about doing is kind of implementing and enforcing the laws that we and others in this community work so hard to push for, to try and create some of that pay equity through whether it's the Equal Pay Act, the Agricultural Workers Bill, and to try and increase the wages. I think minimum wage, as you saw, is not enough for folks. So we need to do more to go above and beyond what we've historically seen as the bare minimum.
So I'd like to start with something positive, which is compared to some other states, Colorado does have the advantage of having an automatic adjustment to the minimum wage in the Constitution. Thanks to a lot of the people on the call, and CCLP worked on that. And so we're not stuck with the $7.25 an hour federal minimum wage. And more recently, we passed the authority for local entities to have a higher minimum wage, and Denver has taken advantage of that. I also want to mention that we really have a high labor force participation compared to other states. And so poverty may be less related to people not being in the workforce than it is in other states. Some of the issues that we've been working on, it seems like there's a developing have not divide when it comes to digital equity. where more and more people really need to have a decent device. They need to have some kind of trust of digital resources. They need to have a good internet connection to apply for jobs, to do their job as it changes and automates over time, or to have any kind of upward mobility. And so we've been working on the state digital plan. Another one is big issue is that current workers often can't afford to stop working in order to go through retraining, and businesses often invest more in the higher level employees in a business, and those who are more entry level are kind of left on their own to find a path to get some kind of training. And I would also, I'll close with that for a lot of people, a barrier is lack of intergenerational wealth or any kind of saving reserve, which can lead them to try to meet basic needs through the use of credit cards and other debt.
Thank you, Shar. And someone asked for you to increase your volume if you can.
I'm on my max.
Okay.
So I'll try to talk a little louder.
Thank you. So let me ask the following question. And I know some people are putting forward a solution around universal basic income or UBI. Others are referring to it as guaranteed income. What might a version of that look like in Colorado?
Well, I'll feel free to kick that one off. And I mean, in some ways, this country has a universal income, and it's called Social Security. It is limited to people over 62 or 65. But it really is a pretty universal source of income for people who are older. So having some kind of universal income that keeps people out of extreme poverty is not unheard of. It was actually in 1967 that Martin Luther King called for a guaranteed income, and 2 years later, President Nixon called for a reverse income tax. So it's not, although it's a very popular topic right now, it has pretty deep roots. And there are a lot of pilots going on here in Colorado. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I was just, yeah, there's the Denver Basic Income Project, which is looking at people experiencing homelessness. There's also been others related to family, friend and neighbor child care providers. There's a whole community of practice of people doing these pilots in Colorado that the Women's Foundation and Impact Charitable has convened that we've been participating in. And I'll leave it at that.
Sure.
Actually, let me add one more thing.
Please.
So when we look at self-sufficiency, what guaranteed income is trying to do is not to replace all income. It tends to be something that supplements the existing income to bring people closer to the self-sufficiency level. However, there is an issue where when people have low income, particularly if they get that income from public benefits, that if you add in an extra layer of income in order to get them closer to meeting basic needs, that often can trigger them losing some of those income supplements or work supports if they're trying to add to their work income, which is a challenge that a number of groups are working on.
So I'm curious, Charlie, you just reported on the self-sufficiency study, and how can we affect the federal poverty line in a positive way that is more realistic to what people are experiencing in terms of the real cost of living?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know that I have a great answer to that either. But I will say, one of the, it's an advantage, I think, for researchers like myself and for advocacy folks to be able to, provide such great detailed information about the income needs for, I think it's over 700 different family types living in all 64 of Colorado's counties. That's, a tremendous source of information for us. On the other hand, I think it does make it difficult if we, I think we often get the question, well, why don't we use this instead of the poverty measure as sort of the guideline for eligibility for these programs? And I think, on the other hand, that complexity does make it so that it would be, I think, really difficult to administer in a lot of ways as sort of an eligibility criteria. And so that said, I think that there is, some good support. And I think we saw it just in the discrepancy between, what the self-sufficiency standard estimates and what the federal poverty guidelines are in terms of what folks need for income in order to get by and have all their basic needs met, to, advocate for increasing those eligibility thresholds using the federal poverty limit to be higher than what they are today. And so, I think we clearly see that there's, a large group of Colorado households who are not eligible for these public benefit programs, but would still benefit from them and help, it would help them to meet their basic needs. And so if we're not, if we can't shift to a self-sufficiency standard type accounting of eligibility, even just increasing those eligibility thresholds for, say, Medicare, SNAP, Medicaid, SNAP, housing choice vouchers, et cetera, to be more realistic in terms of what data and research, like the self-sufficiency standard, show us are necessary for folks to cover all of those expenses that households may face in a given year.
So it's fair to say, I think, that one, Ellen talked about the barriers that exist, certainly for people that have either a criminal background or are just being released from incarceration. The barriers there are evident. Source of income is also problematic in terms of just accessing affordable housing and so forth. It sounds like we are taking a two-pronged approach, and many of our partners are joining us in this, where on the one hand, we are ensuring that we have, minimum wage increases over time, right, on the one hand. On the other hand, there are some safety nets, Social Security, disability income, right? There are some safety nets, although albeit very limited and not as robust as we might like. But then there's this other prong, if you will, approach to really looking at ways to solve poverty. And if we can reach the levels of self-sufficiency, and even referring to it as self-sufficiency is plagued for a number of reasons, but I'll leave it at that. But even if we can achieve that, and I will give a shout out to our state partners, who many agencies do rely upon the data that comes from self-sufficiency standard and incorporates it in their hiring practice. So there are many state entities that do rely upon our self-sufficiency standard and use it. But the self-sufficiency standard is really that second prong where we are seeking to really move the needle on poverty so that and it also has its imperfections, right? But we're working on making sure that it better reflects what it would look like and what kind of income people in Colorado really need. Any closing remarks before I turn it over to Dea?
I would just mention another player in the whole income world is our tax code. And part of the reason for the growing inequality has been tax policies nationally and locally. There's been a lot of work done recently in this state by some of the folks on the call, Colorado Fiscal Institute and others, to beef up. We've doubled. This year we're going to have a 20% of federal earned income tax credit. We're going to start paying a child tax credit We have a 1-year credit for seniors who don't, low-income seniors who don't get the senior homestead exemption. You know, for too long, we've sort of given tax breaks based on who had the best lobbyists. And I think in the last few years, we have started to right that ship, where we are trying to avoid aggravating inequality through our tax code.
And just real quickly, if I could jump in, I think, you know, one key player here that we haven't talked about is employers. And so I think, you know, making sure that employers are aware of the self-sufficiency standard and what their employees need in terms of income to really, you know, cover all of their basic expenses and, you know, be the best employees that they can be when they show up to work, not having to worry about paying bills or, you know, getting food on the table or paying rent at the end of the month, you know, and really, you know, using hopefully, you know, that I think that's part of our work as advocates, is to sort of raise up, you know, the findings from the self-sufficiency standard to show, you know, just how expensive it is for workers in our state to get by, and how divergent that self-sufficiency standard estimates are from things like the minimum wage, or even, you know, just the median wage earned by households in our state. And so I think employers play an important role too in helping us close that gap.
Thank you so much for both of your contributions. Let me now turn it over to Dea Zavalia. Dea is one of our senior leaders at CCLP, and we're really proud to have her. And she has no easy task here. Her and Morgan have both been collecting the questions that you all have been positing and comments, and will be facilitating now the larger discussion. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tiffany, and welcome everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me, but I want to begin the conversation by, first of all, inviting you all to join the conversation alongside us. You've had a chance to hear from the team members of CCLP on what we're working on, but now we want to hear from you all. So just a reminder on what Bruce shared at the beginning of the session. Bruce shared, make sure to raise your hand if you wish to come off mute and join this conversation. But we also encourage you all to enter your comments into the chat. As Tiffany shared, my team member, Morgan Turner, is anxiously awaiting your questions through the chat, which will then pose and enter into a little bit more of a conversation with one another. What we really want to invite you all to share is you know, how is income self-sufficiency impacting the work of your organization, your community, or your personal situation? As I shared earlier, we have a team member that's monitoring the chat. So if you feel more comfortable sharing virtually, you are more than welcome to, but we also invite you to just click on the raise your hand option to join us in this virtual space as well. So I will wait just a couple of minutes and turn to my peers and see if anyone else is raising their hand. I see one question already in the chat. Housing, housing, housing keeps going up and there's nowhere to dwell anywhere. How do we mitigate this? Don't know if anyone on the panel wishes to respond.
It's such a big topic. That's why we devoted the last session just to housing, because it is, I mean, even in the charts that Charlie showed, I mean, I think it was the biggest block, either that or childcare, depending on the age of the kid, I think.
Yeah, that's right, Shar. So, I mean, thinking back to that household, two-person, one adult, one infant, I believe, a preschooler it was, that was living in Douglas County. You know, according to the self-sufficiency standard, their estimated housing costs would be $2,000 per month, which honestly is probably an underestimate, and you know, they'd probably be lucky to find housing that rented for $2,000 per month. But that said, I think it's interesting to also compare that just $2,000 a month housing cost to what the poverty measure estimates as of total income needs for that household. It wasn't even close to covering housing by itself, let alone having money left over to cover other expenses. So, definitely agree, Randall, that housing is a huge issue, and it is a huge driver, and very interrelated to being to this question of income and sort of the findings of the self-sufficiency standard.
Thanks, Char. Thanks, Charlie. I do see that we have someone that's waiting to join the room. And so I will ask my colleagues to bring Jeanette into the conversation. Jeanette, hopefully
Yeah,
you are
can you hear me
unmute.
okay?
We can.
All right. So I live in Larimer County in Fort Collins, and the city planners, for generations, they've been doing a really lovely job. We do pay extra taxes, but we have a lot of parks, a lot of diversity, and it's really enjoyable. It's a great place to raise families. One of the unique things that they did, and they continue to do, is they'll buy apartment complexes that need to be remodeled, remodel them, and then let low-income housing folks move into them. So that keeps everybody with a place to go. Some of them, you have to have income to move into it, but it's a basic, it's not very much, right? It's around $1,500, I think, for 2 people to get an apartment subsidized around $600 a month or so. But there's, some cities don't reinvest into their own people. That is federal money that could be circulated within the city if the city stepped forward to accept more people on housing vouchers into their own complexes. And they're beautiful, they're efficient. The city workers do a beautiful job of taking care of them. And it's really safe. It feels really good to be here. I think with the universal income, I keep swinging back around to the WPA, and that's how social services got started, was the WPA. I think a lot of people who are on services like food stamps and housing, they want to give back, and there's probably not a place for them to give back that doesn't penalize them by removing their food stamps or housing. So I think there could be a work share kind of situation with the WPA where people who are getting services are offered a place to also volunteer or participate in the greater good for the community. And I recently called the state archives and I asked them about WPA records, and they're in boxes. We don't have our statistics put together from the WPA. They gathered a really beautiful, unique data. Stories, it'd be really beautiful for reparations to bring forward that data and stories of the previous generations. And I just feel like if we used a cooperative model, that it would bring a lot more equality. So the cooperative model is kind of like we're all in it together. When you lift one, the whole boat, right? When you lift one, you lift them all kind of deal. And I'd love to see that in play a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, for offering that. I do want to just call out one of the participants that I see in the audience today, Center for Community Wealth Building, which is a fantastic community-based organization based in the Denver metro area, really focused on cooperatives and community wealth building. It's in their name, but really thinking differently about the models that we use around income and building towards self-sufficiency. So I would be remiss if I didn't call out the amazing work of CCWB, Center for Community Wealth Building, and their voice to this conversation. I also just wanted to point out a quick comment that was mentioned earlier, and I think related to Anna, but I'd love to bring Anna, if you're open, or other members of the panel, bring your voices into this conversation. I think earlier in the thread, Anna had talked about a reference to the cliff effect. Are there any policies on the table to address this issue? Folks from the CCLP team, please chime in. And then of course, others in the audience, we also encourage you all to lend your voice and what you've heard. So I will turn it over to the CCLP team because I see Shar just came off of mute.
Well, I did put it in chats, but in particular, the TANF bill that passed directs the State Board of Human Services to develop a different earned income disregard policy, because currently, often when people are on TANF, the minute they get a job over 20 hours a week, they can lose their TANF because they're over the eligibility limit or the standard of need. And also on some of the guaranteed income projects, the that whole community of practice that the Women's Foundation has convened, that they're looking at how to keep people from losing benefits if they get accepted into a guaranteed income project. And my hope certainly would be that if it shows that you can succeed if you didn't have cliffs, that maybe we could extend that elsewhere.
Thank you, Sharon. I do see, Anna, we've unmuted you if you wish to lend your voice, but please no pressure as well. But we certainly wanted to give you the virtual space to share.
Good to see you again, Daya. We work with low-income families, and we hear this day in and day out. We have our financial health course that we offer to our participants, and we share their frustration. Like even without the guaranteed income or subsidies, even people that want to be able to save more and have better change jobs to get a higher income, they face these limitations. Like there's a disincentive to actually saving more, earning more, because then you lose all these benefits that are worth thousands, and so people are caught in this trap. My frustration is I wish I could give them some hope that there is these policies on the table that we're trying to address these in the different federal programs, and because this has to go through Congress, I don't know. Do you have any hope that this is ever going to change?
Well, I have hope that things will change. There are some things like the earned income tax credit that doesn't have a cliff because it tapers off. And to some degree, housing can be like that if you are, one of the lucky ones who can get a subsidized unit. If your income goes up, you have to pay somewhat more rent, but you generally don't completely lose your apartment. But other programs like SNAP, the food stamp program, is very inflexible, and so is SSI and some others. And so there is some pressure to say that that's not a good program design. And some places are approaching this with waivers, which is like, okay, we're not asking to change the rules today, but we want to have permission to try something different and see if it works better. But on the other hand, that can add momentum to really, if enough states start asking for waivers, it's sort of the message that things are counterproductive the way they're set up.
Thank you for sharing that, Shar. I do also just want to open it up for others that, again, are our attendees that may be aware of something either emerging in the policy space. I just want to give a moment or two for others that may be able to respond to Anna's question. If there's something in your community or your radar that you all are tracking, please feel free to use the raise hand function, and we'll work quickly to make sure that you're unmuted and are able to join the conversation as well. While I'm waiting for folks, I just want to check in with Ellen and with Charlie to see if there's anything else you all might want to add.
I was just reading Don Burns' comment about the fact that there are only 25% of people eligible for TANF benefits, and those who are eligible for housing vouchers aren't actually receiving them. I think there's a lot that goes into it, including government bureaucracy, but also the deterrent effect of just the way that our society functions in terms of how we, classify folks who use these types of benefits. I know I always bring this up, but the criminalization sometimes of folks who are trying to access benefits. And, you know, if there's one little thing wrong, you're committing fraud. So there's a lot of very real personal stories, you know, that I've heard one-on-one of people who are just not willing to even deal with that at all, or go through the bureaucracy to actually get what they're entitled to. So I think that that's a really big problem as well when we're talking about, you know, okay, we have these safety net programs, but we don't provide meaningful access to those. I know that was a little out of the realm of what Anna was discussing, but I was just kind of taking a look at the chat.
Yeah, and I think just to tie into the self-sufficiency standard report here, one thing that the University of Washington does as part of the report that's forthcoming is to sort of model how receiving different income supports through programs like CCAP, housing vouchers, Medicaid, and food stamps or SNAP, how that affects your income needs and what income you need to get by. And, you know, if you have all of those different supports, you know, it's transformational for people that are able to receive all of those things in terms of their ability to make their income cover all of their essential needs. And one thing that the report does is, and I don't have the updated data, or else I would have shown that as part of the overview presentation, but sort of models how a household's ability to remain self-sufficient or remain sort of being able to cover all of their basic needs, how that changes as they phase out of these different programs or experience those cliff effects. And I'll say, you know, a big one is childcare, CCAP. You know, that for most households, if you are above the self-sufficiency standard, once you lose that support, if you have it, then, you know, you're more than likely to be, you know, dropping down to about, you know, I'm looking at the chart, roughly, you know, to 80% of your income needs being covered through your income rather than the full 100%. And so that, you know, those cliff effects are real and do have a really big impact. And we can see that empirically and through the data from the self-sufficiency standard.
Charlie, I want to just pick up on one thing that you mentioned specifically around childcare and speak to a lot of efforts that I know have happened over the last several years in just establishing childcare cooperatives, again, as a way or as a means to really continue to support those in their neighborhood, in their community that they know are in the cliff effect and feeling that, but also as a way to build self-sufficiency and to some extent even personal wealth. So I just wanted to call that out. Don, Don Burns, I see that you have your hand raised. We're going to take one last question, so I will give you the opportunity to chime in on this conversation as well.
Okay. Do you want me to go ahead?
Yes, you are. Go ahead. You
okay.
Go for it.
I want to go back to something that Ellen said a minute ago, which is attitudes about poverty. It seems to me in the long run that we have to do a much better job of understanding why people have the attitudes they have about those in poverty and those experiencing homelessness. All of the negative stereotypes, all the stigma is attached to some of the most disadvantaged people in our society. And if we really are going to solve some of these problems, we have to understand more about what those attitudes are, where they come from, and how we can change them.
Yeah, thank you, Don. I think that's certainly something several of us on the call and CCLP team certainly agree. I see Patrick Horvath has joined us as well and has his hand raised. So I do want to give Patrick a chance. It looks like you're on mute, Patrick, so you're able to chat alongside us now.
Great. So Patrick Horvath here from the Center for Community Wealth Building. I worked for many, many years at the Denver Foundation. Some of you may know me in that role, but was really pleased to be able to join CCWB just in the last couple of months. One thing I wanted to talk about, or just kind of bring into the discussion, is the role that business ownership plays in income. We're talking about income and self-sufficiency here, and we're looking a lot at the sort of government benefit side and cliff effects and the kinds of things that interventions at the policy level can do But one of the things we've been working very hard on with a number of others on this call at Center for Community Wealth Building is business ownership and the kinds of access to business support and sort of market opportunities that are often elusive for business owners of color and for people who have been kind of marginalized through the communities that they live in, or their demographic background, from access to capital and from access to the kinds of markets that they need to really have their businesses succeed. I don't want to go kind of Ronald Reagan on you here and say, let them all start small businesses. That's the answer to poverty. It's not. But for many, many people who do have an entrepreneurial spirit, and including some folks coming out of the incarceration system, starting your own business does not have the same barriers that trying to get a job from other people do. It's a special breed of person who can succeed as a business entrepreneur. But for those who do, it's important, I think, that we try to remove as many barriers as we can, and also get the market to encourage the market to swing around to recognizing the importance of business owners who have traditionally been excluded because of systemic oppression and racism. And to do that, we have been working on a project called Shop BIPOC, all one word, SHOP BIPOC, which is about to launch at shopbipoc.com. And it is a way for those of us on the call and for others in our networks to put to kind of walk our talk by spending money with business owners of color who may have suffered from systemic discrimination in the past, lack of access to capital, that sort of thing. And there are many, many good folks who are working on this project, including CDFIs such as SEDS Finance, and RMMFI, Rocky Mountain Microfinance Institute, to try to get organizations and individuals to spend more of their discretionary dollars and their procurement dollars with business owners of color, again, who have maybe faced discrimination in the past. And in addition, we have an anchor strategy project that works with large anchor institutions, health and medical institutions, and higher ed institutions in particular, to get them to bend their procurement policies to focus on supporting BIPOC business owners in their supply chain. And that is also showing great signs of promise. So again, thinking about how the market how we can take advantage of sort of the double revelations of the COVID pandemic and the racial reckoning to get folks who are now saying, how can I do more in my community, to actually change the way they spend their dollars. That also can lead to significant increases in income and move people up that self-sufficiency standard that we've been talking about.
Patrick, you and I go way back, so not to belabor the point, but I do. I really appreciate you bringing that perspective, especially to this conversation around income and self-sufficiency, because again, oftentimes business ownership in entrepreneurship, typically we have a stereotype of what we may assume is an entrepreneur, and often fail to acknowledge that several entrepreneurs are Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color who don't necessarily have traditional means to capital, and often rely on friends and family to simply get their business started. And so opening that conversation, I think, and bringing your voice was really helpful, especially as we at CCLP even think about what does this mean to us internally? What does this actually look like? I don't know, Shar, Charlie, Ellen, if there's anything that you all want to maybe bring into this conversation around this point that Patrick just raised.
No, the only thing I'd add is just that I really appreciate you raising that point, and I think it raises a larger point, at least for me in my mind, which is that there isn't, nor should there be, one way to reach self-sufficiency, to reach your income needs. That there needs to be multiple ways and multiple paths for individuals, starting from where they're at, to help them along, whether that be through finding employment, through starting a business, through going back to school, whatever that looks like. That we need to be thinking and creating systems that are flexible and resilient and able to allow folks, from many different pathways to that self-sufficiency. There's not just one, and nor should there be.
Yeah, I think a couple of things, and we may have chatted about this briefly during the housing conversation, and I see a little bit in the chat right now around models around the country related to wealth building through real estate for small businesses. And I again, Patrick, you are still in this conversation. So I don't think it's early to share. We as CCLP, working alongside partners like Center for Community Wealth Building, are certainly wanting to support community-based organizations that are looking at these kind of creative models, which gets us a little bit into this policy conversation, where I'm slowly going to move us in that direction. But what are those potential policy solutions, right? Purchasing and acquiring property for small businesses, let alone for home ownership, can be really challenging for folks. And so there really is looking outside of the traditional models to what else is happening around the country that we may be able to look at here locally. When I say locally, I mean the state of Colorado. So ideas around community land trust, commercial community land trust, again, to be able to preserve places and spaces. What are those potential policy solutions? I think one thing that we have been working on at CCLP, which connects into this conversation, is around business navigation. CCLP was recently selected by the City and County of Denver to use ARPA, so the American Recovery Act dollars, to support business navigation, so that all these businesses located in what are neighborhood equity stabilization team neighborhoods, so those neighborhoods that are at high vulnerability for displacement, have access to resources, have access to a business coach, have access to opportunities in ways that I don't think have been seen before in the City and County of Denver. But speaking to a policy level, it really starts to raise up what are those other things, what are those potential advocacy opportunities at the state level when it comes to ARPA funding, when it comes to other federal funding that might be rolling down. A couple of strategies that I've heard already during this conversation, certainly around cooperatives and how do cooperatives play a role in income and self-sufficiency. But I want to maybe turn it over to others on the call. What are some ideas that you all have been floating around, either in your current work or the work of your partners, that we as CCLP might want to keep on our radar? I see a lot of activity in the chat, but if folks are compelled to join us, please feel free to raise your hand, because we certainly want to hear your voices. And then, of course, CCLP team, please feel free to chime in on other policy solutions that you all have been hearing about in our communities. And just as a reminder, if you need a reminder on how to engage, again, it's the raise your hand button, and we will certainly bring you into the conversation. And then also feel free to bring into the chat. I'm going to just point out something that I see in the chat right now from Dindy. Encourage BIPOC building ownership over just nonprofit structures. It's incredible how many resources are available if you're a person of color who wants to start a nonprofit, but nearly none to just start, support, and sustain a for-profit business. And that needs to be balanced out through legislation and non-traditional methods of access to capital. That's a really interesting point. Thank you for bringing that in. Not to put you on the spot, but really to anyone, if folks have ideas, if anyone is actively working on that, that's certainly something that would be great to hear. Rita, I see that you posed a question. I want to invite you to bring your voice in. It looks like you are unmute and are able to join us now.
Yes, thank you. So I've been wondering for quite a long time, and I think Shar answered the question, why we can't use the $2 million plus revenue of marijuana tax revenue. It seems that it's just sitting there. We're really not using it for roads or schools. Some of the children can't even attend schools because there's no air conditioning. Seems like we still have the same potholes around the city. So I know it was designed for specific purposes, but I don't think they've been using it for even the specific purposes. So to me, just thinking if this was a perfect world, why can't we use it to help the businesses and housing? I think it would solve a lot of problems. I mean, it's definitely not going to solve all of our problems, but I think it would solve a lot of problems. Thank you.
Well, everything is changeable. A lot of people think just because something's in the law that it's a set deal, but we change laws all the time. And likewise, even though I do believe and CCLP, one of our best-selling reports prior to Charlie joining us was a report on how we use pot money, because there isn't as much as people think, but it attracts a lot of interest. And I think all you need to do is change the Constitution. And all you need for that is, signature collection in every county up to a level of, I think, 5 or 6% of all the people who voted. It's very hard to do unless you have a lot of money or a huge swaths of volunteers. And that was done on purpose. It was called Raise the Bar. It was a ballot initiative by people who thought kind of our ballot or our Constitution was getting too cluttered. So we can change the Constitution. And some of that money does go to schools, but only to school like construction improvements, capital improvements, and like the medical marijuana taxes. I think some of it was earmarked for research on the effects of marijuana, and it didn't get spent for a while because it was illegal to have marijuana at CU, et cetera, because it was against federal law.
Right.
But then they did sort of resolve that. But a lot of those things are changeable. It's just, sometimes a really big hurdle. So you need to either build a network or find somebody who might underwrite it, join forces with others, put together a package. It is a challenge.
Thank you. I think it's something we should look at because I just don't see that we're spending that money. And I think it would have.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay.
No, continue, Rita. Continue.
No, that's it. That's all. That's just been something, a point of contention for me where I don't see that we're using that money. And I think this would be the perfect opportunity for us to use the money for good. Housing, businesses, etc. And especially, air conditioning in the schools that had to close this week or today that didn't have air conditioning. You all know about the potholes on various streets, and I still don't think that those potholes have been repaired. It seems like year after year, we still deal with the same potholes. So yeah, I know it's a hurdle, but maybe it's something worth looking at.
Thank you so much for that, Rita. I want to bring in Randall. He has had his hand raised, so I want to make sure that we bring him in, and then Janelle, and then we will move to wrap up this conversation. So Randall, you should be unmuted and able to speak to us.
Right, thank you. I work with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. I'm on its boards and have been for most of my adult life here in this area. One of the things that John Parvinsky said recently in a meeting that we had was that housing is a right. And we don't look at it that way. And having anything like a self-sufficiency standard, which does not include the possibility of it, because housing choice vouchers are not for everyone. I live in a non-congregate shelter called A-Loft under protective action at the first because of COVID. And come December, it closes. And I have gone around and around about the need for purpose. And we still don't have a basic income that includes housing. And until we do, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll be at the Housing Colorado Conference in Breckenridge to talk to people about it, we will not be able to have a decent standard of living from birth to death. And then we should be basically be able anywhere in this land to make it possible for us to be safe and to start our lives that way and not have to have the ignominious sense that our life is futile or of no importance because of the fact that we're not safe and stable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randall.
This is Janelle. Thank you, Randall. Because without stability, there's no way for us to, feed our families. Our mental health can't be stable without housing. Housing is like the #1 necessity. And I've been homeless before. Right now, I'm in subsidized housing where they take 30% of my and where I pay 30% and I'm still struggling. I'm a single mom. I'm in a program that, of course, uses HUD and it's subsidized. So if I make over, to get in, you have to make less than 35. To stay in, you have to make no more than 55. If you go over 55, you begin paying market rent. Market rent right now, I'm in a 3-bedroom because my son just moved out and it's me and my daughter. So now they're like, well, they're gonna take me out where I'm at and put me in a 2-bedroom wherever that becomes available. So I might even have to move actual locations. But then on top of that, I'm paying $1,600 because I work 3 jobs and I pay six days a week, sometimes 2 jobs a day, and I'm paying and having to pay $1,600 is ridiculous. We're just not able to make it even with the programs. And I wish there's a lot of people coming out with different programs, different ways for housing. We don't want any more low-income housing. We need people to go to homes. I don't want to be in low income. I don't want subsidized. I don't want Section 8. I don't want any of that. I want home ownership. And that's what it should be. They're building tiny homes and giving that, oh, well, this is your option now. We don't want that either. They need to, ask the public, what is going to be beneficial. They're building homes, 2-bedroom homes. It just is wasting. And you're right, like we need land trust. They're building homes out here with not giving any of the people equity. So educating the people on what equity is and what home ownership means. But ending and stop building all these low income. And if you're going to build affordable homes, then make them luxury. We should have the same gardens. We should have pools. We should have rec inside. They're just throwing up stuff and giving us no option, forcing us in, and then we're paying still $1,800. Like I'm paying for a 3-bedroom. I don't have a choice, and so so the programs, they're just not working. We need to pull money from the state. HUD has had money for a long time. The housing is not a part of all of the direct human services. Housing is the only one that's not a part of it. They've been getting funding for a long time and it's not working. And we need someone to take that money, get that money from them. And let's start using it for what the community has asked to use it for, because the state's giving them those funds because they're granted. Why are we continuing to grant the same system that has not worked for years and years and years and still is not working in this present day? And my last comment is these corporations, they're building, like for Green Valley, for example, there's older adults that have been living there years and years, and all of a sudden their taxes went from $600 a year to $2,000 a year on a fixed income, and there's no way. They have the stuff called special tax, where they're building communities, pulling finances to build a community. And then when you buy the house, you're required to pay that finance back. And so you're paying back the loan, and then the company refinances. There's no regulation, there's no law into when we don't have to pay into that anymore, or how much do the owner have to pay. And so I think it's education and getting rid of these corporate builders that are just coming out here buying up everything and raising up the prices. They're literally putting people out of homes. Even when the subsidized housing isn't working anymore, market rent for a 3-bedroom is $1,800. I can't afford that. I'm going to be on the street from subsidized housing to back homeless if something doesn't happen. So thank you. That's my piece.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Randall. Thank you, everyone, for just lending your voice to this conversation. I think the CCLP team agree with me. There's never enough time for us to dive into the conversations, but I think a lot of what's been lifted up today in terms of policy and solutions is that this really is an interconnected issue. They are not silos. Housing is not siloed. It's not separate from income. It's not separate from self-sufficiency. Everything really does work together, and it's really a system that we're looking to affect change. And so I genuinely want to thank all of you for engaging in the conversation with us today. And for those of you that joined our previous call, again, thank you around housing. Thank you for joining that call as well. This is simply a continuation. I'm going to turn it over to Tony with the CCLP team to close us out on today's conversation and to lay out what to expect in the future. So Tony, I will invite you to join us on the screen.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to echo Dea on that. Thank you all for joining us and for your willingness to speak with our panelists and your fellow attendees in the chat and on the call. Just as with the previous event, in the days to come, we are going to share out the video of the event, and we'll do our best to also bring together the different questions and comments and resources that you've all generously shared with us. We hope you found this event valuable and would love to hear from you also on how we can make these forums as useful as possible. The follow-up email that we'll send out will also include a brief online survey link. I'd love to hear anything you feel comfortable sharing with us about the program, the format, technical difficulties, really anything at all. So thank you all again for joining our second Policy Forum event, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.